Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're in 1 Peter chapter 5, and we're going to be looking at verse 6 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, thy words were found, and I did eat them. And thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, as we said previously, verses 5 through 7 of 1 Peter chapter 5 deal with the humility of the saints. And last lesson, we saw that Peter is encouraging them. He says, yea, all of you be subject one to another and be clothed with humility. Why? Why are we as Christians to be clothed with humility? Because God resists. God sets himself in battle against those that are proud, but yet God gives grace to the humble. God pours out his grace and gives it to those that are humble. And then he says, and this is where we begin this lesson, in verse 6, he says, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. So he says, humble yourselves. And this Greek word is typainao. And like we saw last lesson, for humble in verse 5 is typainos. This Greek word in verse 6 for humble is the same form of Greek word. It's typaino. And it's in the passive voice, imperative mood. The original Greek text means be humble. Be humble. All right? Passive voice means that you receive the action of the verb. So it means that therefore God is the one who is producing the action. And God is actively humbling us, and we are passively receiving God's humbling work. And it's in the imperative mood, meaning that it's imperative that we let God humble us. So he says here in verse 5, for God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. And verse 6 should say, be therefore humbled. Allow yourselves to be humbled. God was using the persecutions and the sufferings that these Jewish believers were experiencing to humble them. And that's what if you've been following these lessons here in 1 Peter, this whole letter is Peter writing to the scattered Jewish believers in Asia Minor who are experiencing suffering and persecutions because they're not only Jews, but because they're believing Jews. And that's the main reason why Peter wrote this letter. He wrote it as a letter of encouragement for these suffering Jews, to encourage them in their walk with the Lord. That's the gist of this whole letter. Yeah, there's other things that he included. Oh, by the way, while I'm encouraging you in this, understand something. Jesus suffered too. And while you're at it, make sure you submit yourselves one to another. But throughout this whole letter, Peter is dealing with the suffering and trials and tribulations. And he's explaining to these Jewish believers in Asia Minor that this is the way it should be. It's okay. God's going to bless you. Yes, it is normal for Christians to go through times of persecution and suffering. It's okay. Jesus went through it too. And you will also. And so that's what this whole letter of 1 Peter is about. It's mainly about encouraging these believers in their times of sufferings and trials, to encouraging them to stay true to the Word of God, to stay faithful to God and to pray and to love Him through it all. Listen, do not despise the persecutions and the rejections that you experience, and don't let them turn your heart away from God. Don't let these things turn your heart hard towards the Lord. Let them do their work and see them as coming from the very hand of God, and allow yourself to grow deeper in humility. Don't take these persecutions and trials as something negative, but receive them as from the hand of God as a blessing. I know, I know it's hard and it's difficult to see a trial, to see a tribulation, to see persecution as something that is a blessing. I understand that. But we need to learn to do that. We need to learn to see the hand of God in these things, in these trials, in these tribulations. We need to see God's hand as God allowing them to come into our life to cause us to be more humble. To let these things do their work and cause a tremendous amount of humility. Because when you humble yourselves to them, God blesses us. God gives us grace. There is what? Grace to the humble. Great God gives grace to the humble. So he says here, humble yourselves. Be humbled. Allow yourselves to be humbled. Therefore, what? Under the mighty hand of God. When someone gives you their hand, it is an act of extending their whole being to you. When someone shakes your hand, they are giving to you their whole being. All of who they are is represented in the hand. A handshake, a touch on the cheek, a couple holding hands, leading your hands, lending your hands to help someone. These are all expressions and extensions of your being. As you help someone, as you touch someone, as you shake their hand, you are extending all of who you are in that hand. As Matthew Henry said, humbling ourselves to God under his hand is the next way to deliverance and exaltation. And to allow ourselves to be humbled by God under the mighty hand of God, that's the best way to be exalted in this life. To be under God's hand means that we are under God's authority to produce humility in our life. And it also means that God's hand is a source of protection. So God's hand not only delivers the trials, not only do the trials and the persecution and the sufferings come from the hand of God, but also it's by the hand of God. As we submit under the hand of God is where we find our protection. God's hand is producing, in a sense, not the source of, but God's hand is allowing these things in our life, but at the same time, God's hand is protecting us from them. To come out from under his hand means that we open ourselves up to all kinds of dangers. To stay under God's hand. It is the only way to learn humility from God. And as we do, God begins to exalt us while we are where? God begins to exalt us while we are under his hand. Exaltation of God comes by being under his hand, not by standing on top of his hand. If you want to be exalted by God, You have to stay under the hand of God, under his protection, not exalting yourself to go up and stand up on top of his hand. There's no protection there. So he says here, humble yourselves, therefore, be humbled under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. And the Greek word for exalt is hupsao, and it means to raise up, to lift up. In God's world, listen, in God's world, being taught humility always comes before being exalted. But beware that when God does lift you up, that you don't allow pride or comparison or a judgmental attitude to creep in. Because if it does, if God humbles you and then he begins to exalt you, and then you begin to take that exaltation and turn it into a negative thing, into pride, if it does, then God will have to put us back under his hand, back into the classroom of humility again. So he says here, be humbled under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you, that he may lift you up and exalt you. But don't take that lifting up in a way of pride or don't turn it into a negative thing where now, if you're lifted up in your heart, now God has to set himself against you again and humble you. But stay humble, even as he exalts you. Stay humble. And then he says that he may exalt you in due time. In due time. And this Greek word means in season or in time. And, you know, this is not, in this phrase, in due time, is not what our sinful human nature wants to hear. What we are really thinking is, God, I've been good. I've been a good boy. Now exalt me right now. Right? We think, God, I've been suffering now for 3 years under this situation. Isn't it time for exaltation now? Right? Isn't it a little bit time to be exalted now? That's what we want. We want to be exalted like now. But in due time means that God is in control and he determines the proper time. Every person is different, and it does no good comparing yourself with others as to when you think you should be exalted. How come they got exalted before I did? Right? What was so special about their suffering that they got exalted soon after? Right? This is the old sinful nature coming out. Comparing, judging your suffering with someone else's suffering. Why did they get exalted before you? Or, God, how come I got exalted before they did? How come I got released and I'm resting now and they're still suffering? You know. And we all into this comparison and judgmental thing. Look, just don't be comparing. Don't allow yourself to be looking at others. But just let God do his work. A true test of humility is, can you wait? Can you wait? James chapter 4 and verse 10 says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord. And you know what? It says, and he will lift you up. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord. And the promise is that he will lift you up. And sometimes maybe humility, maybe the lifting up comes after death. Maybe the lifting up comes after you die and you enter into eternity in his presence. Maybe it's here on earth. Maybe it's later after you leave this earth. But the promise of God says, humble yourselves under the hand of God, and he will exalt you in due time, in his time. Okay? Until next lesson, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.